Russian citizens settled in the Crimean Peninsula by Russian leader Vladimir Putin are leaving the Crimean territory as a result of the Ukrainian army's air strikes on the Crimean Peninsula. Russian citizens living in this region have started to leave Crimea. Nearly 200,000 Russian citizens who believe that Vladimir Putin is unable to ensure Russia's security have started to leave Crimea in droves since the beginning of the Russian military occupation of Ukraine. The Crimean Peninsula has become a major military base for the Russian army. Most of the ammunition and weapons sent to Russian troops in Ukraine are smuggled into Ukraine through Crimea and distributed to Russian headquarters from there. In addition, thanks to the military air bases in Crimea, Putin has carried out numerous airstrikes on Ukrainian territory, putting the Ukrainian army in a very difficult situation. Aware of this, the Ukrainian government organized a large-scale operation to locate and destroy Putin's military bases and ammunition depots on the Crimean Peninsula. The Ukrainian forces, which destroyed one of the largest air bases of the Russian army with unmanned fighter jets, managed to deal a major blow to Putin, taking action with 8 Bayraktar unmanned fighter jets. Ukrainian forces heavily damaged 152 combat helicopter and 3 Su-27 fighter jets of the Russian Air Force. Shortly after this operation, Ukrainian authorities contacted pro-Ukrainian resistance organizations operating in Crimea and planned a major act of sabotage. These resistance organizations, which have been operating in Crimea since the beginning of the war, have managed to inflict considerable damage on Russia. The Ukrainian intelligence service located one of the Russian army's ammunition depots in Simferopol. Thus, in cooperation with pro-Ukrainian resistance organizations, an operation was launched to destroy this ammunition depot. Ukrainian resistance organizations formed a team of 18 resistance fighters. This team mobilized late at night and made great preparations to blow up the Russian ammunition depot. The insurgents managed to sneak into the ammunition depot guarded by Russian soldiers and placed the plastic explosives they had in their possession in the ammunition depot. After placing these timed explosives, the insurgents quickly left the area and waited for the explosives to be activated. After minutes of fighting, there was a huge explosion and the ammunition depot started to catch fire. After this latest incident in Crimea, Russian citizens living in this region started to leave Crimea urgently. It is well known that Russian leader Vladimir Putin settled a large number of Russian citizens in Crimea when he occupied the territory in 2040 due to the large number of minority citizens living in the Crimea. Vladimir Putin sold these minority citizens as a threat to him as part of the assimilation policy that the Russian government has been pursuing for years. Russian citizens were settled in Crimea in order to control the minority citizens there. However, the recent explosions and fires on the Crimean Peninsula have exhausted the patience of the Russian citizens in Crimea as the Ukrainian army's operations against Crimea increased. Russian citizens living in Crimea started to think that Vladimir Putin does not care about his people in Crimea after these events. Thousands of Russian citizens gathered in major cities such as Sevastopol in the early hours of the day and started organizing protests against Putin and the war. The people protesting against Vladimir Putin demanded an end to the war and the return of peace. However, the most remarkable event in Crimea was the traffic on the Kerch Bridge. Hundreds of vehicles were queuing on the Kerch Bridge trying to leave the island. Russian soldiers were stationed at the end of the Kerch Bridge to prevent Russian citizens from leaving the island. For this reason, many Russian citizens tried to leave Crimea by sea. The number of Russian citizens who rented boats and tried to leave Crimea by sea was in the tens of thousands. In order to prevent Russian citizens from fleeing Crimea, Putin declared a red alert and activated the Russian National Guard called Rosgvardia. A large number of Russian National Guardsmen set foot on Crimean soil and tried to suppress the uprising. Russian citizens, even though the Russian National Guard managed to prevent these protests by intervening harshly against their own people, they could not prevent Russian citizens from leaving Crimea. The recent explosions and fires in Russia and Crimea have increased the anger of Russian citizens against Putin. For this reason, many anti-Putin and anti-war protests are being organized across Russia. One of the things Vladimir Putin fears most is that his own people will turn against him. To prevent this from happening, Putin does not want his own people to know about the war in Ukraine. For this reason, he has banned any anti-war and anti-Russian Mediterraneos in Russian television channels and newspapers. As it is known, Vladimir Putin had previously arrested a news reporter who took anti-war action on live TV. However, there were still television channels in Russia that tried to report independently in order to prevent these channels from reporting. Putin fined them under various pretexts. The channels that could not afford to pay these fines were soon shut down. Russian opposition officials who want to use Vladimir Putin's aggressive policy in Ukraine as an opportunity to oust him from his throne have also taken action against Putin. Many Russian opposition officials have started to organize speeches in many Russian cities. Opposition officials who are trying to get the support of Russian citizens think that Putin will lose the election with this war, according to the surveys conducted by independent polling companies in Russia. It is seen that Vladimir Putin's vote loss is over 15%, so it seems unlikely that Vladimir Putin will be re-elected president in the next Russian elections. There are main reasons why Vladimir Putin is so hated by his own people, but the most important one is Putin's forced recruitment of his own citizens into the Russian army. As it is known, more than 300,000 Russian citizens were conscripted into the army through partial mobilization and sent to fight in Ukraine. This is exactly why the Russian army has suffered so many casualties in Ukraine. These soldiers are sent immediately after a very short period of training, but this training is extremely inadequate. These soldiers who have no experience of war can lose their lives in a short time on Ukrainian soil. Many experts, researchers had warned Vladimir Putin about this, saying that these soldiers are inexperienced and do not have any knowledge about war will lead to their death very easily. Experts, researchers did not want these soldiers to be sent to Ukraine. However, despite these warnings, Vladimir Putin chose to send these soldiers to accelerate his invasion of Ukraine. Before the start of the war, Russian leader Vladimir Putin and Kremlin officials promised that the occupation of Ukraine would be completed in as little as a week and that Russian soldiers would not be harmed in any way. But now we can see that the Russian army's losses on Ukrainian territory are over 200,000. At the same time, the Russian army, which has lost a large number of armored vehicles, tanks, ammunition, and weapons, is going through a very difficult period. The Ukrainian army has managed to recapture many regions on the Russian occupation and added Russian equipment to their own inventory. As it is known, many tanks and armored vehicles belonging to the Russian army were exhibited on the streets of Kiev in recent months. The Ukrainian army is repairing the intact vehicles such as tanks and armored vehicles captured from Russian forces, adding them to their own inventory and using them against the Russian army. Previously, Ukrainian officials had made a joking statement about this issue in order to draw attention to the equipment captured from the Russian army. The Ukrainian government made a joking statement that Russia ranks first among the countries that have helped the Ukrainian army so far. There are several good news. First of all, the Ukrainian General Staff confirmed that the Ukrainians conducted several more successful attacks on Russian bases. This particular report focused on the situation in the Zaporizhia region. Here the Russians have relocated a lot of troops and equipment. As you remember, the Ukrainians had already struck the newly arrived forces before the new year. However, apparently this was not the end. After the first series of strikes, the Ukrainians took some time to identify the next biggest areas of forces concentration. And it turned out that the most popular and destinations were Abasini Polog, Berdyansk, and once again, Tokmak. As a result of the second series of strikes, the Russians lost around 250 troops and a dozen pieces of equipment. The General Staff specified that they had already confirmed that 175 Russians were hospitalized and that 12 pieces of equipment were destroyed. And on top of that, the General Staff also noted that they had identified and destroyed another ammunition depot in the region. If you add up the losses from yesterday's precision strike on the Russian base in Makiivka, then we can see that in 2 days the Russians lost almost 1,000 people just from several Ukrainian precision strikes. By the way, yesterday's strike on Makiivka could not be ignored due to its notoriety, and Russian sources confirmed that the Russians indeed placed 600 people in one building just 20 kilometers from the front. They confirmed that this building also had a lot of ammunition in the basement, which detonated and amplified the destruction. They confirmed that the building was completely wiped out, although they still assert that only 70 people out of 600 died. One of the reasons why the Ukrainians were able to conduct such a successful series of precision strikes is simple. Before the new year, the Ukrainians hit multiple Russian objects deep inside Russian territory. On top of that, the information war seems to have been launched in order to emphasize the imminent threat that the Ukrainians posted the historic Russian capitals, Moscow and St. Petersburg. Russian sources started increasingly reporting about the capabilities of Ukrainian drones and confirmed and amplified the anticipated threat in order to minimize the risk of a successful drone attack on Moscow. The Russians moved a lot of air defense systems closer to it and deployed 2,000 people just for this specific task, inevitably compromising the safety of Russian military objects along the front line. The good news is also coming from the Bakhmut area. Here, a lot of developments happened south of the city. Last time the Russians started storming Klyuchevskaya, the Russians established their positions along the tree belts and railways, but they struggled to advance on the settlement itself. If you look at the 3D map, we can see that there are a lot of hills in this area. At first glance, it seems like the Ukrainians are at a disadvantage because they are located in the lowlands. However, the Ukrainians stepped back from the central part of the village and focused on holding the key defensive positions, which are located north, west, and south of the village. This way, Russian attack groups that were attacking Kaliska in front would enter the lowlands and almost put themselves into a pocket. This is exactly what the first wave of attacks was successfully repelled. And that is why the Russians started trying to go around the village and attack the key defensive positions on the high ground directly. When it comes to the northern defense positions here, the Russians did not manage to cross the railways and their attacks here have stalled. The same cannot be said for the southern defense position. Here the canal covers the Russian flanks while they can advance along the tree belts from Kozhumaivka and Andreyivka day after day. The Russian control over this region had been expanding until the Ukrainians conducted a counterattack. Interestingly, the counterattack was directed down the chain towards Kozhumaivka. According to the Institute for the Study of War, later, geolocated footage confirmed that Ukrainian forces entered the northwestern sector of Kozhumaivka. Geolocated footage posted on December 31st showed that Russian forces were forced further west of Zelonopila. This way the Ukrainians gained access to the eastern side of the canal and forced the Russians that were attacking Kaliska from the south to immediately step back. Otherwise they would be shot in the back. So the Ukrainians effectively killed two birds with one stone. Overall, the Russians here lost weeks of progress and their Bakhmut encirclement operation has stalled once again. But despite the lack of visible progress, heavy fights in this region continue. The Russians will definitely try to leverage their control over the area east of the canal to return back. The Ukrainian army continues to grow stronger day by day with its fight against Russian invaders. The ongoing conflicts in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions have increased their intensity in the new year. The war has spread all over the east of Ukraine. On New Year's Eve, there were very intense clashes on the eastern front. Russian troops tried to advance from eastern Ukraine but failed. Russia lost thousands of soldiers and tons of ammunition in the first week of 2023. Russia started its offensive with missile launchers on New Year's Eve. Russia targeted the fronts in Mykolaiv, Kherson, Donetsk and Luhansk regions by occupying these regions. Putin was planning to expand into Ukrainian territory, but there was one thing Putin forgot. The Ukrainian army was getting stronger day by day in terms of military personnel and ammunition with the support of Western and European countries. The Ukrainian army had deployed military personnel and equipment systems to the entire eastern region, along with the fronts where Russia was concentrated. Soldiers belonging to Russian troops in the region were being monitored by Ukrainian intelligence. On New Year's Eve, there were only a few minutes for all the clashes to take place. Ukraine entered the new year by destroying Russian missiles with its air defense systems. Almost all attacks of the Russian Air Force was blocked by the Ukrainian air defense. Ukraine's counterattacks caused fireballs to appear in the sky throughout New Year's Eve. Ukraine carried out many successful operations on New Year's Eve. One of these operations was ambush by Ukrainian soldiers on Russian soldiers. Ukrainian soldiers destroyed a Russian tank platoon after a successful ambush. In this operation, which took place 150 to 200 kilometers behind the battlefront, the Russian army lost dozens of tanks. The Russian army continues to suffer huge losses. Russia has suffered many losses since the first day of the war. Russia has lost more than 110,000 soldiers. It lost over 3,000 tanks, over 6,000 armored combat vehicles, and about 2,000 unmanned aerial vehicles. Having suffered great losses against Ukraine, Russia is now approaching the end. It is stated that Putin cannot solve the problem of soldiers and ammunition. Zelensky, on the other hand, has had many opportunities in the war because of his relationship with the leaders of Western and European countries. Recent videos shared on social media show some of the power of the Ukrainian armed forces. The latest videos show the equipment that Ukraine has acquired with the help of Western countries. Ukrainian soldiers fire these weapons in the video. According to the footage, the weapon they are firing is being used to destroy Russian tanks. It is claimed that there are very few tanks and armored personnel carriers left in Russia. The reason for this claim is the images shared on social media. In the latest images shared on social media, it is seen that tanks belonging to the Russian army and Soviet-made BTR-80 armored personnel carriers are destroyed by the Ukrainian Air Force. The use of Soviet air equipment in the war is interpreted as the Russian army running out of military equipment or that the army does not have modern equipment. The British Ministry of Defense made a statement while it was being said that Russia had a problem with soldiers and ammunition. In the statement, the information about Russia's military mobility was shared. The ministry stated that Russian troops are trying to strengthen their positions in the city of Crimea. This region was a region that was under the pursuit of the Ukrainian army to repel the invaders from the Eastern Front. Fighting intensified in this area. Crimea is a city in the Luhansk region. Fighting has intensified in Luhansk and Donetsk regions over the past few months. Russia had also suffered heavy losses in Crimea in recent weeks. Images of these losses have emerged. The footage shows the Ukrainian 59th Motorized Infantry Brigade destroying two Russian T-64BV model tanks. In the footage recorded with a drone, it is seen that the Russian tanks exploded violently and became unusable. Russia had to withdraw many of its troops from Kremlin. Kremlin is still under Russian rule, but after increasing losses, it seems that Russia's dominance here will come to an end. Kremlin is a very important city for both countries. Sergei Haidai, The governor of the Luhansk region stated that if the Russians lose this region, they will lose their entire defense line because this region is located in a strategic position on the Russian-Ukrainian border. Casualties mounted as the war intensified. Russia lost over 110,000 soldiers. The armed forces of Ukraine made a statement about the attacks and increasing losses. Important points were mentioned in the statement. The Ukrainian armed forces said that all the attacks they carried out were aimed directly at Russian targets. He also stated that this is the difference between the Ukrainian army and the Russian army because the Ukrainian armed forces stated that Russia attacked civilians and made plans over civilian targets. Putin's attacks on civilian areas may be aimed at breaking the morale and motivation of the people because Putin wants to break the will to fight off the faithful Ukrainian people who resist the occupation. The reason for this is that he has not been successful on the line. When Putin fails in physical warfare, he tries to make psychological breakthroughs. But the Ukrainian people are getting stronger with every attack. They believe more Putin continues to lose in every field. That's why the number of calls for negotiations from Russia is increasing in the last week. As the war has intensified, Russian and Ukrainian leaders have expressed their openness to peace talks in the last month or two. Calls for peace negotiations have increased. This is because both countries have suffered in the war. Russia has been hit hard by Western and European sanctions. Russia is facing huge problems both militarily and economically. The Russian people are organizing demonstrations and protests almost every day for an end to the war. Russia is not giving up on its conditions for peace talks. Ukraine, on the other hand, does not accept these conditions. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba stated that peace talks can be held with the mediation of the United Nations. One of the latest statements about the peace negotiations came from Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Erdogan had a telephone conversation with Russian President Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. After the call, he stated that calls for peace and negotiations should be supported by a unilateral ceasefire and a vision of just solution. As calls for peace negotiations increase, so does the intensity of the war. Russia has retreated on many fronts. Ukraine continues its successful offensive. Fighting has increased in the eastern region. The war is spreading to more and more regions every day. It seems that the new year will bring many important developments in the Russian-Ukrainian war.